Hello and welcome. I'm Alastair Stewart, and for the next 2 hours I'll be keeping you company here on TV and radio with the stories that really matter across the country and indeed around the world. We've plenty coming up today, including a special programme noting 1 year since the start of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have a fantastic lineup of top guests from the worlds of politics and diplomacy, from here, from Ukraine and from Russia. Plus, good folk who simply did their bit to help. But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the day's news. Here's Bethany Elsey.
Alastair, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. Ukraine's president says he plans to meet China's Xi Jinping after Beijing set out a peace plan for the war between Ukraine and Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky didn't say when the meeting might happen, but told a news conference in Kiev that it would be beneficial for both countries and for security around the world. But US President Joe Biden told ABC News Beijing's proposals only benefit Moscow. President Zelensky says he wants to believe that China is not siding with Russia.
It's correct to think that if there are already thoughts that somehow correspond to respect for international law, territorial integrity and some security issues, I believe we should use this and work with China on this matter. Why not? I want to believe that China will be on the side of a fair peace, which means on our side. This is very important to me. I really want to believe that China will not supply weapons to Russia.
The Prime Minister has vowed to keep working towards securing a post-Brexit trade deal after an in-person meeting with the European Commissioner has been called off. Ursula von der Leyen was expected to meet with Rishi Sunak this weekend to discuss the Northern Ireland Protocol after positive talks yesterday. Cabinet ministers have reportedly been put on standby for a potential conference call over the weekend, with Tory MPs given a 3-line whip to attend Parliament on Monday. The number of people who've been killed in the earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria has surpassed 50,000. The United Nations estimates the destruction has left 1.5 million people homeless, with 500,000 new homes needed. President Erdogan has pledged to rebuild homes within the year, but experts are warning authorities to put safety before speed to ensure new buildings can withstand further tremors. And a 3.7 magnitude earthquake was felt in South Wales last night. The British Geological Survey says it hit Bryn Mawr near Cricklehowell just before midnight, with the tremor felt as far away as Cardiff. Residents on social media have described being woken up to their whole house shaking for a short time. Detectives investigating the attempted murder of an officer in Omagh in County Tyrone say the incident is being treated as terror-related. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell remains in a critical condition after being shot outside a sports centre on Wednesday. Police in Northern Ireland have now arrested 5 suspects and say the new IRA group is their main line of inquiry. You're up to date on GB News. Now, though, it's back to Alastair.
Bethany, thank you very much indeed, and a very good afternoon to all of you on this, the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll take the same approach as we have from the very outset of that conflict, talking to old friends of mine, and we'll also keep ourselves alert to all of the comings and goings, because it's 1 year on, but it's by no means over. We'll keep our eyes open and our ears open for any breaking developments, and either I will bring them to you or Bethany will in her news bulletins. I'll also be speaking to other experts who I now count as friends, having grappled with this story since it started. Now, an anniversary is not a full stop, but it does offer a pause for reflection, forward speculation and hopefully intelligent analysis. Now, the imagery of this story has been stark from the outset, from the tens of thousands of Russian troops massing on the border with Ukraine and on Belarusian soil with the support of Putin's friend and ally, Lukashenko. Now, it didn't really take the geniuses at the CIA headquarters at Langley and their army of satellites to figure out what Putin was up to. His strategy and his curious reasoning behind it have been made crystal clear in a series of speeches and articles these last few decades. Now, we felt that we knew him, but not so much his adversary, President Zelensky of Ukraine, who grew from being a comic actor to a respected player on the world stage. Now, the Kremlin sought to paint him as the leader of the neo-Nazi remnants in Ukraine. He was accused of being a money grabber and even a drug user too. Most of it to be taken, frankly, with a pinch of Siberian salt. And many here wore blue and yellow as a simple sartorial display of solidarity with the aggrieved Ukrainians. Badges combining the Ukrainian flag and the Union Jack graced lapels across Parliament, not least courtesy of Boris Johnson, but more besides was forthcoming in weaponry, diplomatic pressure and nudges among perhaps reluctant NATO allies of ours. The imagery, as I say, of war is ghastly. But we've seen plenty of curiously lighter moments, like Ukrainian farmers towing away Russian tanks and Ukrainian soldiers giving the V sign to the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Mokhbar, which had been attacking their holdout on a small island. That ship was subsequently sunk, much to the embarrassment and anger of the Kremlin. Now, those events were celebrated in postage stamps, demonstrating perhaps a government or certainly a postmaster or postmistress with his or her finger firmly on the pulse of a remarkable and resilient people. There was also the visual evidence of war crimes, or as the US Vice President Kamala Harris put it, war crimes against humanity in Bucha, Mariupol and Kyiv itself. There were also the refugee camps in neighbouring countries like Poland, who also welcome many fleeing persecution. It has already been said by China that the Belarus President, Lukashenko, will go to Beijing in an official state visit on February the 28th. But the Chinese have ducked and dived from the outset, and even now there are talks of them rearming Russia's depleted armories and arsenals. We have guests warning this could all lead to the Third World War on this programme, and Vladimir Putin has reversed out of arms limitation treaties and has warned of a new generation of nuclear weapons. One of Zelensky's most potent clarion calls was perhaps when he said, if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, he won't stop until he gets to Berlin. We begin our programme with the work of a GB News colleague and friend of mine, Darren McCaffrey, who's been talking to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. Here's their conversation.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. I suppose, first of all, the question is, we're 1 year into this. Let's talk about the British public here. Should they be braced for a conflict that potentially could go on, not just for the next year, but for years and years to come?
Well, of course, what we want is for this war to come to a conclusion quickly. We're seeing tens, hundreds of thousands of people dead and wounded. We're seeing huge damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. We're seeing disruption to energy supplies, food supplies. So all of us want this to come to a conclusion. But it has to be a conclusion that respects the charter of this place, the UN Charter, which basically says you can't invade your neighbour, you can't extend your boundaries by force. And that is a principle that we have to defend, and we have to support Ukraine until they are victorious. We don't want that to drag on any longer than it has to, but we're in it for as long as it takes.
So what would you say, though, to those British public who look at the amount of money being sent to Ukraine, who look at the military aid and then look at the state of our military and think this isn't sustainable? You know, are you fearful that support could break down?
Well, of course, we are always conscious that the British people have got their own challenges. They want to ensure that they can pay their bills, and the Prime Minister is relentlessly focused on our own domestic economic improvements, and he is passionate about that. But we should all recognise that if this isn't resolved, then it will cost us more in the medium and long term. This aggression by Russia has been in large part the reason why energy bills have gone so much. That's had a knock-on effect for food prices. If this isn't resolved, the costs to us will increase, and not just us, to everyone around the world. That's why getting resolution to this is so very important.
Let's look at kind of EU relations, if you like, in this context, in the sense that, relations since Brexit haven't necessarily always been at their best. Is it your sense that in some ways, actually, the Ukraine war has brought you, the UK, and the EU closer since 2016?
Well, I think what's happened is that we have been reminded that there are some incredibly important geopolitical issues where the UK and the member states of the European Union are naturally and instinctively closely aligned, and we are working together to defend the things that we value. I think we have been reminded that we are healthier, happier, wealthier, more secure when we work together. So, of course, we've been working closely with our European partners on this issue and on things like the Northern Ireland Protocol and our collective self-defence. We will always be an engaged international player, and we're very proud that countries all over the world, not just in Europe, recognise that.
How concerned are you about China potentially supplying weapons to Ukraine? That could be a game changer, couldn't it?
Well, the point that I have made publicly and directly to the Chinese authorities when I've met them is that I can understand why Russia desperately wants to have a stronger and closer relationship with China. I don't understand why China would want to import the international isolation that we're seeing here at the UN, whilst why they would want to import that into their relationship. So the message that I would send to all countries is that there is no benefit to helping Russia when 141 countries around the world have voted to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine.
Just very finally on this, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said that Russia shouldn't be humiliated, maybe defeated but not humiliated. Is that the view of the British government as well, is that we know, looking at the historical context, that Russia shouldn't be humiliated in this war?
What we are relentlessly focused on is defence of the UN Charter and international law and Ukraine's self-defence. And that is the totality of what we're trying to achieve. We saw the Russian representative in the UN chamber claim that we're trying to break Russia up or destroy Russia. That is nonsense. We are here and supporting Ukraine because they are being attacked, and I'm here at the UN because the UN Charter is under attack.
Can you be as explicit as Emmanuel Macron in saying we will not humiliate Russia?
We have no interest. We have no interest in anything other than defending the UN Charter and Ukrainian self-defence. And the world should recognise that. And this war could come to an immediate conclusion if Vladimir Putin were only to recognise that.
Let's move on to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Ursula von der Leyen spoke to the Prime Minister today. There's an expectation of a deal. How close are we?
Well, look, it's really difficult to predict these things. We've been negotiating in good faith for quite some time. I had always committed not to give a running commentary, which I know is frustrating to your viewers and my political colleagues alike, but it has proven to be a successful formula thus far, and so I'm going to stick with it. Of course, we want to get this resolved. The people of Northern Ireland deserve to have their institutions back up and running. They deserve to be a fully integrated part of the United Kingdom, which of course they are. We want to protect that. We want to protect East-West trade. These are the things that we are negotiating. The negotiations, of course, have been tough. They've been complicated, but they've been entered into in good spirit with good faith. I really hope that we can get this resolved, but we will resolve this when we have addressed all the issues that we're seeking to resolve, rather than some arbitrary deadline.
So can I ask three principal questions then, if you're not going to do a running commentary? I mean, how important is the DUP support? Essentially, is it vital to this deal? Just on principle, that the DUP need to agree to it?
Well, we want to make sure that all the communities in Northern Ireland and their representatives, including the unionist community and the unionist political parties, plural, are comfortable with the arrangements that are in place. That underpins the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
So it sounds like a yes.
That we get cross-community support. We want to make sure the people, the politicians and the businesses feel meaningfully part of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister is a unionist. I'm a unionist. I'm a unionist to the soles of my feet, and that will always be at the forefront of our negotiations.
And just finally on this, Suella Braverman, some of your other cabinet colleagues have said that the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, should not be ditched in this deal. Is that your position again? Is that your principal position, that that has to remain?
Well, the whole point of these negotiations and the whole point of us laying the bill in the first place was to give us multiple ways of trying to address the issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So my focus is on getting the result rather than the mechanism to get the result. We've always said the bill's there, it's important, and but our preferred option is a negotiated option. But as I say, the bill is there and the negotiations are ongoing. But ultimately, I would say to everyone, I've said this publicly before, we remain focused on the outcome rather than the method, and the outcome is to protect Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, to make sure that people and businesses and the political representatives of those people in Northern Ireland are comfortable with the resolution, whilst also making sure that we protect the UK internal market. Those are very much our motivations. That's what will drive our actions.
Okay, just two final points away from that. One is on opinion polls. I mean, the Conservative Party, if anything, seems to be getting worse in terms of their lead. How disheartening is that when it seems that increasing numbers of the public simply do not want you guys in government anymore?
Well, the message that I've been picking up, both on the doorstep and looking at the granularity of opinion polls, is that Labour have spectacularly failed to make the case. Now, I know that what we need to do is demonstrate to the British people that we are addressing the issues that they concern about, bringing down inflation, making sure interest rates come down, growing the economy, cutting those NHS waiting lists, stopping the small boats. These are the things that we are relentlessly focused on. And as the British people see success in those areas, I think that they will be reassured that the Conservative Party is the best party of government, because we will be increasingly looking at the Labour Party's failure to be on the right side of any of these arguments, whether it's being on the wrong side of industrial disputes, whether it's being on the wrong side in terms of our departure from the European Union. Time after time after time, the Labour Party have got it wrong, and the Conservative Party is focused on delivering for the British people.
Can you give a cast iron guarantee that you're not going to change leader before the next election, no matter how bad the polls get? And I know you're a former boss, that there's no way back for Boris.
So my focus, the Prime Minister's focus, the whole of government's focus, the whole of the parliamentary party's focus, the whole of the party in the country's focus is delivering for the British people, getting on top of those things that I said, growing the economy,
no change
cutting
of
the
leader.
interest rates,
No change of leader.
cutting the NHS
it's really
waiting
easy
lists,
to say, isn't it?
stopping the small boats, and delivering for the British people. And that's what the PM and every single other government minister should be focused on, and indeed are focused on.
Give you one more chance, no change of leader?
We are focused on the British people. Seriously, I know you love it. I know politicos love it, and I know within the Westminster bubble they love it. This kind of, this in the Westminster bubble obsession. The bottom line is, I am not going to do political belly button gazing. I am here to look after the UK's interests internationally, and the Prime Minister is relentlessly focused on serving the British people.
Okay, and just very, very finally, I promise, and it is on that role of being Foreign Secretary. I mean, it's quite intense. It's a massive brief. It's a lot of travel. I mean, it must be exhausting. I mean, I'm exhausted covering you, let alone being you.
Look, I've got a fantastic job. I get to promote the UK on the international stage, and listening to how other countries view the UK, it makes me proud. I've just come from the UN Security Council chamber. I've had conversations with my international counterparts who are incredibly grateful for the UK's leadership on this issue. And it really, really is a reminder that we are still a very important and significant player on the world stage. It is an exhausting job, but it is an incredibly important job, and I'm proud to have it.
And how does the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, chill out? Chillax, if you like.
Chillax. Well, sleep is my preferred method. But I think, as you know, I've let the cat out of the bag about my painting and miniatures, and I don't know whether. But sitting down on those rare occasions where I get an opportunity, spending time with my family is the best way to relax.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren. Cheers.
And that was my friend and colleague Darren McCaffrey speaking to the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly in New York. And I'm delighted to say that a former Foreign Secretary is sitting here live in the studio with me, listening to it and prepared for my questions. Because my first guest, as we reflect upon the events of the last 12 months, is Sir Malcolm Rifkin, former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons, and, as I say, a former Foreign Secretary and indeed a former Defence Secretary. I don't think I even said that we were going to be doing that, but,
no, that's
but you
quite
sat
all right.
there quietly, no notepaper, no diaries and what have you. Interesting on micro-politics, with James saying he's not frightened by the opinion polls because, in his view, Labour have failed spectacularly to make the case for them forming the next government and winning the next election. James also said there's no turning back on Ukraine. Politically and financially, is that sustainable? Did he make the case for it?
Oh, I think that it's not too difficult to make the case, because the last time you and I met was in this studio exactly a year ago after this war began. And the last 12 months have been the best of times and the worst of times. The Ukrainians have shown themselves to be extraordinarily able and resilient and have defended their country. They have preserved the independence of Ukraine. Putin has been humiliated. He has lost territory.
I think it was around about that time, and I suspect we discussed it in that interview, that Zelensky came out with this extraordinary clarion call, as I referred to it in my general introduction, of saying that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will march on to Berlin.
Well, there's a bit of rhetoric in that. He's not going to go anywhere near Berlin. If he can't defeat Ukraine, he could hardly defeat NATO. So that is, I think, a little bit of understandable exaggeration. But it is the case that Putin is trying to recreate the kind of Russian empire that existed when the Soviet Union was around. Now, let's bring it to where we are today, because Ukraine's done remarkably well, but there's now almost a logjam. It's almost like the First World War, with two large armies facing each other, literally in the trenches. And I think the next 2 or 3 months are going to be absolutely crucial, because two things have to be tested. First of all, can Ukraine continue to do, which we hope it will, recover the territory, some of the territory, perhaps all of the territory, that it lost a year ago?
All is crucial, because it means Crimea.
Well, let's be realistic about this. That could take a lot longer. But in the immediate objectives of Zelensky, put the rhetoric on one side, is to recover all the territory, liberate all the territory that Putin's took, which means the land bridge to Crimea and the parts of the Donbass and so forth. Now, the next 3 months will show whether Ukraine can continue. It's already recovered more than half of the territory it lost a year ago.
As a former Defence Secretary and a former Foreign Secretary, would you give Zelensky the fighter jets that he says is
I'll come to that. I'll come to that if I may. But I'm sorry. I said the next 3 months are going to be crucial, not just because of what the Ukrainians can achieve, but also the Russians have greatly increased their manpower through conscription. There is no evidence as yet that that's going to enable them to win more territory, but they haven't made the major effort. So what we could have is either the Ukrainians or the Russians making progress, or the other possibility is neither of them make progress. We are stuck in a logjam, and then we get the beginning of what could be a very long-term situation, which is what's often called a frozen conflict.
Yes. Do you agree with Cleverly that it would be a profound miscalculation for China to provide Russia with weapons? They're described in the newspapers as kamikaze drones.
It would be very foolish for all the reasons that have been said, but there's an additional factor which has just emerged in the last 24 hours, which in my judgment makes it very unlikely that that is what they're planning to do in the short to medium term. The Chinese have announced they want to be peacemakers, that they've put forward what they call as a 12-point proposal to have a ceasefire and to resolve this whole crisis. Now, if that's what they're trying to persuade the world, and people are pretty skeptical because they've been pretty close to Putin, but if that's the impression they're trying to create, it would be totally destroyed if they were simultaneously to start supplying weapons to Russia. So I think for the time being, the idea of weapons to Russia from China is likely to be off the table, and rightly so.
Is this the era of a new world order? Again, we talked about it when you were last in. and you jogged my memory with what you said just a moment ago, that Putin, the KGB officer, was never happy with perestroika, glasnost and the Gorbachev changes and revolution, in inverted commas, and the loss of Comecon and the loss of the Warsaw Pact. He's old school. He'd like to roll all of that back.
He's not entirely old school. He couldn't care less about the end of communism. He has never probably been a communist. If he was one, it was for opportunistic reasons. What he is basically is an extreme nationalist. And it's the Russian state that he believes in. And he does not believe Ukraine has a right to exist. It's quite extraordinary, because Russia has recognized Ukraine as an independent state ever since the 1990s. So that is something he's trying to reverse. And it's a terrible way to behave. You know, there have been a lot of other empires that have disappeared. The British Empire is one of them, the French Empire, and so forth. And what Britain did when the empire, our empire, ended, is we put out our hand of friendship to India, to Africa, to the West Indies, and said, let's work together and let's be friends. And we've got the Commonwealth, and the King is the head of the Commonwealth, following the Queen. So that there is a different way of ending empires. What Putin has done, because he's a brutal despot, is he's not only been guilty of war crimes, he's trying to destroy the very independence. And that is a threat to the rest of Europe if he was to succeed. It's now pretty evident he's not going to succeed, but he may have limited gains, which he may try and hold on to.
Sir Malcolm, a genuine pleasure to see you again. We mustn't make it so long next time. Always a joy to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Sir Malcolm Rifkin there. Former chair, as I said, of the Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons, but also himself a former Defence Secretary and a former Foreign Secretary. My next guest is Lord Kim Darroch, and he is the former UK Ambassador to the United States. I'm going to start off with you, Kim, if I may, where I left off with Malcolm, and that is whether you see these events as indicative of the stuff of a new world order, with Putin trying to, as it were, unpick the Gorbachev legacy, and China desperately seeking to find a role either as an arms supplier to Russia or as the authors of a peace plan, which, frankly, most people, both in Malcolm's trade and in yours, have dismissed.
Afternoon, Alastair. I think we are on the edge of the moment of some very significant changes in the global picture. I agree with Malcolm Rifkin about Putin, not a communist, but a hardline extremist Russian nationalist, whose ambition has always been, if not to create the Soviet Union in name, to create a ring of client states around Russia's borders. A man who has said publicly that the end of the Soviet Union was one of the worst days in human history. Not a view many of us take. So that is a picture. I mean, there was a period, I would say, back in the early 2000s, when it looked as if Putin could become a leader who would engage in Western institutions. He was part of the G8 in those days, and who had good friendships with some European leaders at the time, like Gerhard Schröder and Berlusconi. But he might have become a constructive member of the national community. Well, if that was an illusion, we certainly now see the reality, because what he has done with the invasion of Ukraine is a scar on human history. And you just need to think about the 20,000 civilians, the 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers, the 200,000 Russian soldiers who have lost their lives, not to mention the 8 million refugees who have fled Ukraine, another 8 million who are displaced within Ukraine. 25% of the population of Ukraine have left their homes. Those figures encapsulate a huge amount of human misery, and Putin's is at the heart of this. So yes, we now know what Putin really is. On China, I also agree. I'm sorry to be boring with Malcolm Rifkin. China, I think, occasionally flirts with the idea of getting closer to Russia, of a new Russia-China axis. But the fact they've now launched these peace proposals is interesting. I think it suggests they're not going to be supplying arms to Russia in the near future. Peace proposals may be worth very little. I mean, certainly if they hand significant quantities of Ukrainian territory to Russia, they're not going to go anywhere. But they're trying to portray themselves to the rest of the world as peacemakers rather than as contributors to the conflict. And that's important.
Well, it's also important you raise the humanitarian cost of all of these matters, and indeed they find space in their 12-point plan to talk about the humanitarian cost, not only the military cost as well. So China definitely in play and one to watch. Kim, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for breaking into your weekend to not only take my questions, but also to listen to Malcolm and James's answers to the other questions.
Thank you for your time.
Kim Darrett, great to see you again. Thank you very much indeed. Kim Darrett there, the former UK ambassador to the United States. Many more guests still to come on the diplomatic and political front here and in Ukraine. But first, a short break. And I'm going to pause our conversation about Ukraine and the anniversary of Russia's invasion for just a wee while as we head to Sheffield and join GB News reporter there. They've been, Anna Riley's been talking to business owners in Sheffield, and there she is.
And also impossible to find. So these people have not had a say.
Good afternoon, Alastair. Yes, I'm here in Sheffield city centre where hundreds of people have turned out in protest of the clean air zone that's been introduced by the council on Monday. Now, the council have introduced this. They say there's levels of nitrogen oxide in the air that they want to introduce to improve people's health. What it means is taxis, they'll be charged £10 a day to come into the city centre, and larger vehicles like coaches, buses, lorries will be charged £50 a day if they don't have a Euro 6 diesel or a Euro 4 petrol compliant vehicle. But people are protesting here as they're saying it could turn the city centre into a ghost town. They're saying many traders won't be able to afford the charges each day to come into the city centre, and businesses like coach owners have also told me they can't afford to upgrade their vehicles, and they also fear that it could put them out of business. So this protest today is people gathering together against this clean air zone being brought in on Monday, and we know it's already happening in other cities as well, such as Bradford and Birmingham, Portsmouth. They have these clean air zones, and we know it's on the horizon for other cities in England as well, such as Gateshead and Newcastle, and Bristol. Plans are in place there as well.
Anna Riley, thank you very much indeed for that update there. Anna Riley, our reporter who is there in Sheffield on that protest, business leaders and others protesting at moves to take in measures to improve air quality, which is Sheffield has a great history of, going back to the days of smog as well, and when the steel industry was perhaps a little bigger and the problem was a little bigger. But anyway, business people there saying the successor businesses may well suffer as a result of that move. Anna Riley there with our report. Now, you're watching and listening to Alastair, Stewart and friends, with lots more still to come this afternoon, including new research from which came out this week saying that the price of value items in supermarkets has risen by more than 21% since January last year. We'll be bringing you tips to help you save money while you're doing your weekly food shop and perhaps trying to get round what can only be described as a form of rationing. But before we get to that, a quick break. Well, you've been getting in touch on our big topic of the day as requested, and you've lived up to that challenge, and for that I'm very grateful. Keep it coming in. GB Views at gbnews.co.uk or on social media. To begin our conversation, let's start with John, who says Zelensky is right to explore the option for a peace brokered by the Chinese. Biden's reaction is ridiculous. Perhaps he wants war in Europe to weaken Russian capabilities with no danger to the United States of America. Gary says, I think China is thinking about trying to reach an end to the war in Ukraine in a possible way to allow Putin to walk away from the fight while saving face. Simon says there cannot be negotiations until Russia exits Ukraine completely. And that is his view. Keep your views coming in. You can agree with him, disagree with him, and reflect on what Kim Darroch had to say, Malcolm Rifkin, or any of our other contributors. We've plenty more still to come on this important date for the people of Ukraine. And as Malcolm Rifkin and I were saying, perhaps for the new world order. So do keep those views coming in. And of course, if you missed those earlier interviews, you can catch up with all of them on our previous programmes by subscribing to our YouTube channel. We are at GB News. Now, as promised a little earlier, it's time now for our ever-popular Saturday savings spot now. Research by Which has shown that supermarkets' value items have increased in price by more than 21% since last year. Plus, overall inflation in supermarkets was just under 16% in the year to January. Additionally, Ofgem is expected to drop its price cap on Monday, which will mean energy suppliers will be able to charge around £1,000 extra and could, of course, mean that the average bill will rise by as much as £500 a year. I'm delighted to be joined once again by a regular friend of ours on the programme. That's Levy Winchester, who's the money editor of the Daily Mirror and Mirror Money. Great of you to come on board again, and thank you so much. So what's going on in the supermarkets? Value items that were supposed to help us have been outstripping pretty well everything else in inflation. And as many people who've been to the shops yesterday, the big supermarkets will know, there's an awful lot of stuff there where you not buy one, get one free, but buy one if you're lucky.
Absolutely, and lovely to speak to you again. So, yeah, Which research has highlighted that those cheaper budget ranges, typically those, that people who particularly are struggling will be buying right now, are rising faster than the kind of regular O-brand labels or the premium brands. But I think it's really important to note as well, obviously, while they are rising faster, according to this Which research, they are still cheaper overall. So it's really important to still keep swapping out those branded goods for the cheaper budget labels. And obviously, there are loads of other ways as well that you can save money in the supermarket.
And to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these are pricing decisions that are made exclusively by the supermarkets because they are their own self-defined value lines, as it were. They can't blame what's going on in the marketplace around the world.
Absolutely. So supermarkets, as you rightly said, are in charge of setting their own prices. Just in terms of, if you go back to branded goods, for example, so the manufacturers can obviously set a recommended retail price, but ultimately, yes, it is up to the supermarkets to decide how much they wish to sell a product for.
OK, I mentioned in the introduction, and you know that we're wanted to talk to you about it as well, and that's energy prices, where, again, there has been significant movement in global prices in the correct direction if you're a consumer. And yet Ofgem is likely to lift that cup, and it could result in significantly bigger bills for all of us, or many of us.
So right now, it's best to think of energy bills as a bit of a story in two parts. So on Monday, Ofgem will release its price cap figure for April to July. And at the moment, analysts are expecting it to drop by around £1,000 from its current figure of £4,279. So Cornwall Insights predicting that price cap will fall to just under £3,300. But at the moment, energy bills are not dictated by the Ofgem price cap. We are currently all covered by the government energy price guarantee, and this is set to rise in April. So this is why we are still expecting to see energy bills go up. So the Ofgem price cap, the figure we're getting an update on this Monday, is looking likely to come down dramatically, but energy bills will still rise around 20% come April due to the energy price guarantee, which is set at £2,500 right now for someone with typical use and will rise to £3,000 from April, unless, of course, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt decides to keep prices at their same level during his budget next month. We'll have to wait and see on that.
So this one's the two Gs. It's global prices and it's government policy.
Absolutely. So at the moment, we are set by that government energy price guarantee, and that is the one that is set to rise by £500 from April. Again, unless we hear otherwise from the Chancellor.
I got a nice email from my electricity supplier the other day saying because our heating was not either gas or electricity, but an alternative fuel, we use oil as it happens, And I'm sure that will annoy many people, but that's what we do. We live out in the middle of nowhere and, hey, no gas mains, etc., etc., etc. And my electricity supplier said, we have just put 200 quid in your bank account, which came initially from the government. Every little helps, I said to myself, and mentioned it on Twitter, and lots of other people said, oh, yes, I've had that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so important if you are struggling right now with your energy bills that there are lots of different helps out there. As you rightly said, people who are kind of off-grid and are not on kind of standard electricity tariffs, there is £400 coming from a new portal that has opened just this week by the government. So check on gov.co.uk. If you're not on a regular kind of electricity supply, have a look, see if there is any support to you. And just, I would always say, if anyone is struggling with their energy bills, talk to your supplier straight away. There are lots of things they can do to be helping you. For example, a lot of them have hardship schemes which they can help you with. And another really good tip as well is, go throughout your home, make sure it is as well insulated as it can be. Check the windows, check the floorboards, etc. There are lots of ways that we can help to keep that cost down. And thankfully, as we are approaching spring, our energy usage, our heating should start to naturally fall off anyway for most families. So we should start to see energy bills naturally come down anyway.
All right. Well, fingers crossed. Levi, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for breaking into your weekend to share it with us. Thank you very much indeed. That's Levi Winchester, who is the money editor of Daily Mirror and Mirror Money, with our helpful guide there to what's going on in the supermarkets and what may be happening in the short to middle future to your energy bills. So keep in touch, and you can always read her in the Mirror or online. And we look forward to talking to her again. Now, we're going to stick with our main story of the day, and that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine for today's good causes. And we're revisiting a cause that means a lot to many people, and that is the aid effort by UK citizens in Ukraine, as well as offering homes and refuge here. Lots of you went out to help. Matt Millen, a friend of mine from the equestrian world, and Stephen Barnes also set up with some other chums Ukraine Equestrian Relief, and they were among those who helped, loading up great big lorries that you normally see full of brilliant horses, either off to the races or to the show jumping or whatever it may be, to help. And they ferried horse boxes full of aid over to Poland to those who really were and remain in need. Lauren Barclay is from Ukraine Equestrian Relief and joins us there on the programme. Great to see you again. Thank you very much indeed. So give us a quick refresher course. How many trips did you end up doing?
So the team have just got back from their fourth trip. We've rebranded. We're now called Giving to Ukraine. So we had quite a lot of people confused if we were just providing equestrian relief. So we've rebranded as Giving to Ukraine, and we've just gone our fourth trip. And we're planning more for the next kind of year, 2 years ahead. Ukraine
itself is a great equestrian nation. Was the background to many of you something that they particularly found appealing, or to be brutally honest, didn't matter who it came from, if it was going to help them get through the next few weeks, that's what mattered?
So I'm not myself from the equestrian kind of community. I'm a freelance journalist, but I got involved.
Well, you made a brilliant film for us.
Yeah, but I think it's been a conversation starter definitely when you turn up on the border with horse boxes full of aid. But I think at the time, the people were just happy to take whatever aid they could. Sadly, it's been kind of dropping out the news recently, and we've really seen a decrease in the amount of aid that people are getting. So when we turn up with these horse boxes full of aid, especially on the trip that the team returned from early hours of this morning, yesterday night, I think just the happiness in everyone that we provided things to was, remarkable.
Everything that you've done is remarkable, and thank you for it. And lots of good wishes to the rest of the gang. And I know Matt's working this weekend, but to all of you, it's great stuff. And I'm sure that those people in Ukraine, particularly on the Polish border, will remain eternally grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. And as I say, lovely to see you again, Lauren, and thank you very much for that film that you did for us. You keep in touch with us. It's Lauren Barclay there from Ukraine Equestrian Relief. Now, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has ordered his MPs to attend the House of Commons on Monday, as reports suggest a Brexit deal may have been struck on the issue of Northern Ireland and the protocol. Joining me now to tell us more about that is GB News political reporter Catherine Forster. Great to see you. I was listening to your conversations about this earlier on, and what I hadn't realised until I heard it confirmed in the news was that there was going to be a one-to-one with Ursula von der Leyen, and that's now been cancelled. There's also this story whirling around in some of the tabloid papers about trying to involve the King in all of it. Yeah, that's what I thought as well.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, it does seem, and we have been here before, haven't we? Because we were marched up the hill last weekend about an imminent deal and it didn't happen. But it does seem there was definitely a very positive conversation last night between Rishi Sunak and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
So good it didn't require a face-to-face.
It is strange, isn't it, this news about the King. Now, supposedly, the King was due to have tea with Ursula von der Leyen today. There was some discussion that the deal would be called the Windsor Agreement. Some of that's now being denied, and they're saying, well, you know, the King meets leaders, it's not connected. But it does seem very strange. And, of course, as Jacob Rees-Mogg has said, and indeed others have said too, if the King had met with the European Commission President at this very delicate time, when it seems there's about to be an agreement, that does blur the lines, doesn't it, between the King's role, which is supposed to be absolutely not involved in politics, and what is politically a very delicate
and made particularly delicate because of the very nature of, I mean, the Conservatives are the Conservative and Unionist Party, and of course the DUP, as was said earlier on in the news bulletins, and Charles will be crowned King of the United Kingdom, which includes Northern Ireland.
Yes.
So, I mean, in a sense, it couldn't be more delicate.
It couldn't be, and it's not.
It certainly puts murmuring pleasure about independence for Scotland in its place.
Yes, I mean, all the years that we've been worrying about potential independence of Scotland, and really, isn't there a very real threat now that down the line we will end up with a united Ireland, partly because of the demographic change that's taking place in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin now has a majority, or would have, in the Northern Irish Assembly if it was sitting, which of course it still isn't. And
I mean, if it was tomorrow, it would be literally by the ballot box and not by the bullet that the 32 counties could, at a stroke, come together again.
Yes. So, you know, there is a real concern now that might be, and maybe that may be ultimately the right path, but certainly many unionists, of course, are deeply unhappy because they feel that the protocol, while protecting the Good Friday Agreement in not putting a hard border on the island of Ireland, has threatened peace in Northern Ireland by effectively putting a border down the Irish Sea. Now, Rishi Sunak's deal, as far as we understand, is going to get rid of checks going from Britain to Northern Ireland, which is a big step forward, and is going to minimise the role of the European Court of Justice, but not completely get rid of it. And although Rishi Sunak thinks that has met the DUP's 7 tests, it's very unclear that the DUP is in agreement.
Yeah. Is the mood music changing for him a bit? I mean, if there is tangible progress on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the post-Brexit arrangements, and he can persuade the DUP and his own European research group of antagonists, as it were, on the backbenches who've now got to come to work on Monday and give ear to all of it. And I was struck by something the other day when the public borrowing requirement figures were published that showed that his Chancellor, and he is First Lord of the Treasurer, at these levels of taxation may have more room to move come the budget on tax rates, and he's under enormous pressure, particularly on corporation tax. Is the mood music changing a little for Rishi Sunak?
There doesn't seem to be any evidence that they're going to budge on corporation tax or tax cuts in general at the moment, despite the fact that there's huge pressure being piled upon them. Priti Patel today saying, raising corporation tax is not the right measure, and clearly many in the party are very unhappy about that. If Rishi Sunak can get this deal through, the Brexit sorted effectively, I mean, we've heard this before, haven't we, then that would be a huge win for him. But it's very perilous, isn't it? Because if the Democratic Unionist Party do not play ball, that's going to kick off all sorts of trouble with the European Research Group. And Boris Johnson is intervening quite loudly now to say, let's keep our Brexit protocol bill that's going through the House of Lords. That's the deal we should keep. But of course, that is the deal to basically put in the bin the protocol that Boris Johnson agreed in the first place. And that would bring with it all sorts of other problems, even assuming it got through the Lords, even assuming that it didn't have all sorts of legal charges.
Oh, it's also
there's nothing simple about any of it.
And Zelensky referring to my mate Rishi at the press conference in Kyiv yesterday, not even that sorted out. And I read somewhere in one of the papers this morning that Boris Johnson still keeps a rugby ball in his office in the House of Commons, just in case the ball comes out the back of the scrum. Oh, Daily Mail, I think it was. Oh.
I also read that too. I think we can safely say that Boris Johnson is hopeful of being Prime Minister again, sooner or later.
No, my breath is not being held at all. Catherine Forster, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. GB News political reporter Catherine Forster there with her insight, and always worth every moment of it. Thank you very much indeed. See you later on. That's it for now. We're going to take a quick pause and bring you up to date with the all-important weather. Not the political weather for the Prime Minister, but the weather, the real thing out there for all of you. Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and welcome if you've just joined us. We're into the last hour of our programme, keeping you company here on TV and radio, with plenty more still to come, including more on our main discussion 1 year on from the start of the war in Ukraine following the Russian invasion. But first, let's bring you right up to date with more on that and the rest of the day's news. Here's Bethany Elsey.
Alastair, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 1. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister is facing criticism after proposing a meeting between King Charles and the European Commission President ahead of a potential deal over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Ursula von der Leyen was due to continue talks with Rishi Sunak over the post-Brexit trading arrangement before meeting the King, but her trip was cancelled. Labour's shadow Northern Ireland Secretary says the move would have had constitutional implications. There are reports a new trade deal is nearly complete, with ministers on standby for a cabinet conference call and Tory MPs given a 3-line whip to attend Parliament on Monday. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, spoke exclusively to GB News.
We remain focused on the outcome rather than the method, and the outcome is to protect Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, to make sure that people and businesses and the political representatives of those people in Northern Ireland are comfortable with the resolution, whilst also making sure that we protect the UK internal market. Those are very much our motivations. That's what will drive our actions.
Ukraine's president says he plans to meet China's Xi Jinping after Beijing set out a peace plan for the war between Ukraine and Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky didn't say when the meeting might happen, but told a news conference in Kyiv that it would be beneficial for both countries and for the security around the world. But US President Joe Biden told ABC News Beijing's proposals only benefit Moscow. President Zelensky says he wants to believe that China is not siding with Russia.
It's correct to think that if there are already thoughts that somehow correspond to respect for international law, territorial integrity, and some security issues, I believe we should use this and work with China on this matter. Why not? I want to believe that China will be on the side of a fair peace, which means on our side. This is very important to me. I really want to believe that China will not supply weapons to Russia.
The number of people who've been killed in the earthquakes that have hit Turkey and Syria has surpassed 50,000. The United Nations estimates the destruction has left 1.5 million people homeless, with 500,000 new homes needed. President Erdogan has pledged to rebuild homes within the year, but experts are warning authorities to put safety before speed to ensure that new buildings can withstand further tremors. And a 3.7 magnitude earthquake was felt in South Wales last night. The British Geological Survey says it hit Bryn Mawr near Crickwell just before midnight, with the tremor felt as far away as Cardiff. Residents on social media have described being woken up to their whole house shaking for a short time. Detectives investigating the attempted murder of an officer in Omagh in County Tyrone say the incident is being treated as terror-related. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell remains in a critical condition after being shot outside a sports centre on Wednesday. Police in Northern Ireland have now arrested 5 suspects and say the new IRA group is their main line of inquiry. The Defence Secretary says he's confident the troubled £5.5 billion programme to build new army tanks has turned a corner. The project to build nearly 600 Ajax fighting vehicles has faced criticism over severe delays and technical issues. After nearly 13 years, it's yet to deploy a single tank. Ben Wallace says soldiers are now being trained in how to use them and hopes they'll be active within the military in the next 2 years.
When I took over as Secretary of Defence 3.5 years ago, this was a troubled programme. It started its life in March 2010, and I was determined that we were either going to fix this or have to find alternatives. And so we put a lot of effort into it. We worked with General Dynamics, the prime contractor, and with the Army. I think after its user trials that it completed at Christmas time, it started to turn a corner.
Thousands of displaced Ukrainians are being given the chance to go to the Eurovision Song Contest in May. Around 3,000 tickets will be made available to Ukrainians who are currently living in the country. Liverpool has been chosen to host on behalf of Ukraine, who won last year's competition. The government has announced £10 million in funding to make sure the event showcases Ukrainian culture. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Alastair.
Bethany, thank you very much indeed. Let's return to our top story of the day, reflecting on the war in Ukraine, as yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary since Russia invaded Ukraine. Thousands of citizens have been displaced, lost their homes, and many others lost their lives. Homes have been destroyed, whole communities have been laid waste. The Ukrainians have been fighting since the very first day, but this is by no means the end. There are reports that President Putin is planning a spring offensive. Meanwhile, many European countries and the United States of America, of course, are providing tanks to Ukraine, other hardware and munitions as that country seeks to defend itself and its borders against what it sees as aggression and the United Nations majority see as being aggression as well. We believe in balance here on GB News, and I'm delighted to say that my next guest, I hope, will offer some of that. James cleverly told Darren McCaffrey that there's no turning back on the United Kingdom's support for Ukraine. And that is certainly the case, whatever the Chinese end up doing as mediators or as people supplying arms to Vladimir Putin and to Russia. Putin's also suspended elements of key nuclear arms treaties with the United States of America and has also talked about a new generation of nuclear weapons at his disposal. My next guest is Stepanko, who is a Russian politics commentator but knows a good deal about British politics as well, having worked here in recent times as well. And I'm delighted to say that he joins me live now in the studio. Earlier guests, I know that you'd arrived because I saw you out of the corner of my eye, but I don't know if you heard both Kim Darroch and Malcolm Rifkin saying they don't see Vladimir Putin as a latter-day imperialist seeking to, as it were, reconquer East Europe, post-1989, fall of the Berlin Wall and all of the rest of it. But they do see him as being an absolutely fierce nationalist Russian. And many think pieces here have been written suggesting that even if Putin wanted to end this incursion, he can't afford to domestically, and he's incapable of seeing a way out of it. What's your view?
Thank you, Alastair. The nationalist argument historically for Russia has been an easy one. Even thinking back to the Soviet Union, the idea of uniting all the 15 member states under one nationalist ideology was imperative to having the country cohesive and stay together.
It's a clumsy way of putting it, but many people of my age and older will know exactly what I mean. That Putin was no fan of Gorbachev, and Putin would quite like to get back to the old days of Comecon and the Warsaw Pact.
Yes, it seems that he would do, and certainly the idea to take over Ukraine and the idea for the past 20 years to take over Belarus has been on the table. Of course, Russia back in the 90s recognized the independence of Chechnya and yet went in and conquered the country afterwards anyway. Of course, we had the 2008 war with Georgia. Now we have the provocations from Russia regarding Moldova, saying that Ukraine will go in to Transnistria. Now, Ukraine have always denied this. Moldova has denied this. But it seems that the idea of expansion is still there. And it plays very well to the domestic market. He needs to galvanize the domestic market because he hasn't made any advances, really, in the war in Ukraine. And the only hope he has to stay president, to stay the ruler of Russia, is to make sure that both the elites and the people generally support him. The nationalist argument plays very well in this.
But when Zelensky says he's fighting a war on behalf of the world, he's not contradicted by senior figures in the UK government or by figures in the United States administration.
He isn't, and quite rightly so, because when we talk about the war in Ukraine, Russia says very clearly that it's fighting the West, it's fighting NATO. Putin's saying this, everyone on the Russian media is saying this. And we don't know, really, what will happen or what would have happened if Ukraine did not survive the first initial 10 days. We could have had a takeover of Moldova. We now hear that there's a plan to take over Belarus by 2030. We could have had a war in the Baltics, and the Baltic states are NATO members, after all.
And the Baltic states are amongst the most nervous.
They always knew what Russia's like. From the 1930s and 40s and afterwards, they knew that that was a threat they will eventually face.
Were you surprised at the dalliance between Moscow and Beijing that's going on at the moment?
I'm not. The telltale sign came yesterday at the time of Zelensky's press conference, when, while he was saying that he needs to talk to China, and the Chinese put out the peace plan, with the first statement being on recognizing the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, and all states, in fact. The Chinese came out saying that Putin and Zelensky need to talk without any guarantees. And that's something that Ukraine have always gone against. They always said that they first need Russia out of Ukraine, back to the borders of 1991, or at least last year.
I interrupt only to add one other thing, because I know for a fact you weren't here when we were playing it out earlier, but the UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly also said that he thought it would be a grave error of judgment in Beijing were they to sell weapons direct to Russia, whether it's these so-called kamikaze drones or indeed anything else. A major error of judgment for China.
For China, most certainly. Now, the Chinese have denied this already. The Americans have said that there's not a solid plan, a signed plan, but there is something in the works. The good example is Iran. They have provided weapons to Russia. They will continue doing so, and the whole world is seeing them for what they are. Their moves to prescribe them in the UK and elsewhere. And the only way to move forward, if China does even make the first moves to giving anything to Russia, is heavy sanctions. And that's what the US and other countries have said.
Yeah. Do you believe it is one of those situations that can be resolved militarily? Because both the West and Russia have experience of situations that patently could not be, and Afghanistan comes immediately to mind.
I think the military option is something that will make a big difference. At the end of every war, people come around the table and talk.
Sure.
But we see now that Russia is struggling with its arms supply. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, was saying that they have a third of the shells that they need. We see reports of, Ukrainian reports, mind you, of Russians descaling their artillery attacks and just sending waves of conscripts or potentially prisoners. So it seems that there is a struggle on the Russian part, and further support for Ukraine, be it more tanks, planes, artillery, will make a difference that will push Russia to talks.
This may sound a naive question, but I ask it nevertheless because I'm genuinely intrigued to know what your view is. It is how precarious Putin's personal situation is, or his grip on power still absolute?
Visibly, it's absolute, but the situation with Prigozhin is an interesting sign. So he rose to big prominence with Wagner's role in Ukraine, especially the assault on Bakhmut, which failed. They were meant to take it by March, they won't. So now in Russian media and Russian telegram channels, popular social media in Russia, we see a rollback of that. People are starting to criticize him. And there's, of course, the move to create a Gazprom, potentially a Gazprom private military company that can be seen as a competitor to Prigozhin. Quite frankly, by the end of this year, I'll be surprised if he's alive.
And also some people who were allowed to attend the rallies in Moscow yesterday and the day before, because many were not, but those who were reported that and this was ordinary Russian citizens, left before Putin had finished, or some actually left before he even arrived. So public opinion here is very important. Is it remotely important in Russia?
Well, the rallies are not a good gauge of the public opinion. People were paid to be there. They were paid 500 or slightly more rubles to attend. There are also reports that they were there until Putin spoke without being able to go to the toilet for allegedly security reasons. And then everyone left afterwards. They dumped the flags and they left the stadium straight away. Public opinion is important if everyone rises up, but it seems that in Russia that's not going to happen.
Fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. If you didn't hear Malcolm and Kim, they are available on our YouTube channel, and I genuinely hope and think that you would enjoy them all. Stepan Stepenko, Russian politics commentator, giving his views on the situation in Russia right now and his forecasts and thoughts upon the situation in Ukraine. Great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. My next guest is a British writer and security analyst, Edward Lucas, who I've known for quite some time and respected for all of the time that I have known him. He's a security specialist, but has also worked in many bureaux across Europe and indeed across the world. And there he is. I'm delighted to see you there. And thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start off with you in the same way as I did with Stepan, and that is that both Kim Darroch and Malcolm Rifkin said that they didn't think that Putin was a sort of macro-imperialist wanting to completely unpick the Gorbachev settlement and regain what you and I grew up with as Eastern Europe and re-establish Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. But he was a fierce, and they underlined that word, both of them, he was a fierce nationalist. What's your take, Edward?
I think there's a problem with over-focusing on Putin, the person, because our problems with Russia predate Putin and will outlast him. I think that the key thing to remember is that in 1991, the planned economy, the sort of basis of communist economic rule, did collapse, and no one wants to bring that back. And the political monopoly of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its fraternal parties in the rest of what we used to call Eastern Europe, that really collapsed too. And nobody's trying to bring that back. Even under Putin, Russia has a degree of political competition and different parties and elections and so on. What didn't disappear, but many people thought disappeared, was the Russian Empire. The Soviet Empire had been an empire following on the heels of the old Tsarist Empire. And already back in the 90s, it was clear that that imperialist itch or instinct or whatever you call it was still there. And we saw small wars in places like Moldova and Georgia. Then we saw the war in Chechnya, which your previous commentator, Mr. Stepanenko, mentioned. And we tended not to look at that because we were greedy. We were arrogant and ignorant and naive and many other things. But most of all, we saw Russia as a tremendous source of trade and investment, a huge, great lump of money just waiting to be taken. And this blinded many of our decision makers to the problems that we really saw. Now, Putin accelerated this trend and exemplified it in many ways with his sort of ex-KGB background. And I think that after Putin, we will still have a very difficult Russia to deal with, whether or not he goes spring, summer, autumn, winter, or in the years ahead. But we will still continue to have the Russia problem that we had before Putin came to power.
Sure. I'm going to make one more nod, if I may, Edward, to Gorbachev. I was lucky enough to be in Iceland when Gorbachev and Reagan met in the White House, the White House just outside Reykjavik, not obviously the one in Washington. And they made real progress in limiting nuclear arsenals on both sides. Were you worried when you heard Putin say that he was willing at the stroke of a pen to withdraw from elements of that family of treaties and that he was happy to wave around a new generation of nuclear weapons at his disposal? Do you think, as Mike Jackson told this programme a year ago, there is a tangible threat of a third world war and that it would be a nuclear war?
Well, I think that the key point is that we were doing arms control negotiations in the Brezhnev era, and that one has to put questions of morality, human rights, and all these other things on one side when one's in the very flinty business of arms control, because it's in no one's interest that we have a nuclear war through miscalculation. And we did come quite close to that in the Soviet era, where the Soviets misinterpreted what we were doing and thought that they were under nuclear attack. And we got away really thanks to good luck and the courage of individuals who said, hang on a moment, let's just wait and make sure this isn't really a nuclear attack. So I think that we do need to recreate an arms control regime. And paradoxically, the fact that we are so much stronger than Russia is in terms of nuclear weapons makes that all the more urgent, because when you have two roughly equally matched powers, then there's a kind of stability. If you've got a country that's much weaker, as Russia is, then they're much more nervous. So I think that we need to try and rebuild, both on the nuclear and on the conventional side, the sort of arms control regime that we had at the end of the Cold War. And it will be very difficult. But if you look at today's Financial Times, there's an excellent piece by David Manning, one of the great brains of the old Foreign Office, and Jonathan Powell, who used to be Blair's advisor, on what we need to do to sort of contain and constrain both the Russian menace, but also the risk around the menace. And they're citing George Kennan, who wrote the famous long telegram back in the late 1940s about what to do with the Soviet threat. And one big element of that is to get back into this nitty-gritty of arms control. So I agree with that, and I think it's a pity Putin's doing it, and it will require a lot of work to try and turn this round.
Yeah. Are you clear in your mind, Edward, as to what China is up to? Because you mentioned the Financial Times and that piece there. The West warns of severe costs for nations aiding Russian war effort. And we know that Beijing have pitched in their 12-point peace plan. I also have a copy of that with me here. But also the papers are full of them talking about selling kamikaze drones, as some people call them, to to Russia as well. And Malcolm Rifkin and Kim Darrett both said that they thought that was a very high-risk strategy for China, who was still trying to find its place in the new era world. What's your view?
Well, Alastair, you're absolutely right to raise this, and I think China is potentially the game changer in all directions. So if China has already said very firmly to Putin, don't use nuclear weapons, and that was quite and stop threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and that was already an important intervention, toned down a lot of this very reckless talk that we saw from Russia in the earlier phase of the war. China has helped Russia a bit on sanctions busting and is now the most important economic partner for Russia. If they wanted to, they could pull the rug from under Putin completely and he wouldn't be able to fight the war anymore. So that's one potential thing they can do. If they threw their full weight behind Putin, that would really help him because they have huge quantities of all the things that he's short of, not just drones, but also artillery and trucks and all the other things. And it would be extremely difficult for Ukraine to keep going if you had the full weight of China behind Russia, and it would then turn it very much into a real East-West conflict because we would then be putting huge pressure to bear on China to try and make them stop supporting Russia, and we would be in a very dangerous era. I don't think the Chinese want to go full-on supporting Russia because they've got a huge stake in the world economy, staggering forward as it is at the moment. So they don't want a kind of new Cold War on the economic front. I'm sceptical about whether their 10-point peace plan is really going to work. Because if they were actually seriously engaged in a peace plan, they'd be talking to the Ukrainians. And there's no sign so far that they've bothered to pick the phone up to Mr. President Zelensky. And that would be a sort of be a first sign.
And NATO have made it clear for many of the reasons that you cite there and others that frankly, Beijing simply doesn't have the credibility to be the authors of a plan that would be meaningful.
If you look at what their history, there's only one instance of them being involved in any sort of multilateral diplomacy, which is over North Korea, and they've played a very marginal role in it. I think it's pretty fair to say that the Chinese suck at this sort of thing, and everything they've tried to do in sort of grand foreign policy has been a failure. So it'd be surprising if they became the peace brokers in Ukraine, but they do have enormous weight. If they chose to deploy it and deployed it skillfully, they would make a difference.
Indeed so. Edward Lucas, thank you for your wisdom. As always, a great pleasure to talk to you, as it always is. And thanks for breaking into your weekend to share your thoughts and reflections with us. And best wishes to both of you. Thank you very much indeed. Edward Lucas there, British commentator and analyst on the situation a year since Russia invaded Ukraine and began its full-scale invasion of that country from its own soil and indeed from Belarus. Britain held a minute's silence in honour of the many thousands of Ukrainians who had died since the conflict began a year ago, while Ukraine's allies reaffirmed their commitment to helping the country toward victory over its neighbour. Our reporter Will Hollis has been following events around the one-year anniversary. Here's his report.
It was the siren that signalled the coming change. In a matter of hours, Russia's invasion turned millions of Ukrainians into refugees and transformed tens of thousands of civilians into soldiers. President Zelensky, once a comedian, now a celebrated war leader. We will defeat all threats, he says 1 year on, speaking to his nation. He describes it as a year of bravery and hope, a year of invincibility. The war in the East has been ongoing since 2014, but few believed Russia would launch a full-scale invasion of its neighbour, and in turn that Ukraine could hold out for so long. Since then, 8,000 Ukrainian civilians have died. The true number will be much higher. From the fighting, more than 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers are thought to have been killed. Russian losses could be twice as many. In Britain, the war has been marked with silence. From the start of the invasion, the UK has stood beside its Ukrainian ally. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak welcomed his counterpart in recent weeks. Yesterday, at the Ukrainian Catholic Church in London, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson lighted candles. Meanwhile, King Charles, who met President Zelensky on his visit, said that Ukrainians have endured unimaginable suffering during the war, while applauding support from Britain and its allies. At times symbolic, this street in London renamed Kyiv Road, but weapons are the true signifier of commitment. Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki confirmed delivery of the Leopard 2 tanks his country pledged to the cause.
It's not only documents.
Not only documents. Real tanks are also there.
We have freedom. Give us wings to protect it.
Ukraine asks for jets, but Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says it's not as simple as handing them over, but there are other options.
If there are other countries with Russian or Soviet jets, which they could just transfer over, Britain will explore what it can do to give those countries that reassurance that their own skies will be protected.
Putin's so-called special military operation, for the most part, has failed. Yet he has mobilised his homeland and has resources for a long war. His friends in China have suggested a constructive ceasefire and de-escalation. It's unknown if the Russian leader is listening. But the world is watching, wondering what might happen next. Will Hollis, GB News.
And if you missed it first time out and were wondering what that blue crash helmet was in the Great Hall of Westminster, it was a pilot's helmet that President Zelensky gave to Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons, as a little aide memoir about the need for jets. So says President Zelensky. We've more to come this afternoon on Alastair, Stewart and Friends. After the break, we'll be getting the latest from Newquay as a protest is currently taking place outside an hotel that's been housing asylum seekers. But first, let's bring you up to date with the weather.
Hello, I'm Craig Snow and here is your latest forecast from the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, it's set to remain largely dry and settled across the country. And that's all courtesy of a huge area of high pressure, which is not going to go very far over the next few days. It does bring in a fairly cool breeze off the North Sea. So if you live along the east coast of England or down across the English Channel, certainly wrap up warmly as we go through the next few days here. For the rest of Saturday, we'll see a lot of the cloud melt away, and that will lead to a cold and frosty night for a lot of the UK. But along the North Sea coast, we will maintain some rather cloudy skies, maybe the odd shower here. So temperatures actually staying above freezing here, but elsewhere could see lows falling down to -4 or -5 in a few spots. So then going into Sunday, very little changes actually. We still maintain rather cloudy skies across northern parts of England, eastern Scotland too. That may well filter its way a little bit further southwards as the day goes on. But elsewhere, plenty of sunshine around after that cold and frosty start, with the afternoon perhaps seeing the best of the sunshine up across western Scotland and maybe down towards Devon and Cornwall. And in that sunshine, temperatures will reach about 8 or 9 degrees, but under the cloud, and also if you're exposed to this fairly brisk wind, it will be feeling a good deal colder than that. Sunday evening then sees a repeat performance, a lot of the cloud melting away once again, leading to a fairly cold and frosty night. But along parts of the North Sea coast, again, the cloud will continue to come in, keeping things above freezing here. So a cold and frosty start to the new working week on Monday morning. Best of the sunshine as we start the day across western Scotland, Northern Ireland, down towards the southwestern parts of the country too. But then as the day goes on, this cloud across more central parts of the country will sink its way a bit further southwards. Largely dry though, but there will still be the odd shower around. And as we go into the middle part of the week, very little changes. Largely dry, often cloudy, but feeling cold in the wind.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Alastair, Stewart and Friends here on GB News TV and radio and online, with plenty more still to come this afternoon. I'm delighted to say I'll be joined in a moment by the Conservative Member of Parliament, Tobias Ellwood, and we will be discussing the West's future with the war in Ukraine following the Russian invasion a year ago, and just how much it is costing us as British taxpayers, plus how threatened we should feel about China potentially sending weapons to Russia. But first, before all of that, a quick break. And before I do that, let me say one other thing, and that is to apologise profusely for a little bad language in Jeff Moody's report, not from Jeff, but from one of the people he was talking to. We couldn't stop it. My apologies. But there we are. Please accept my apologies and stay with us for the rest of Alastair, Stewart and Friends. And there he is. I've mentioned him twice now. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Tobias Ellwood, sitting there in his familiar study with an excellent array of books and that now all too familiar statue there of the tower containing Big Ben. Tobias, great to see you. One little bit of breaking news, which I'm sure you will have seen as the chair of the Defence Select Committee. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, claims victory in battle for increased defence spending. There it is, front page of the Telegraph down at the bottom. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Well, let's wait and see. We haven't seen the full spending package. The budget hasn't been announced yet. There are a lot of comments that are made in the weekend papers, perhaps to nudge, to cajole. I do hope the message is being heard in the Treasury. I think you summarised it very, very well. Indeed, we're involved in supporting the Ukrainians, quite rightly, but that's having an impact on our own stocks, our own supply chains, our own equipment. We need to replenish that. And also the world's getting more dangerous, not less. So it is absolutely important that we invest in defence. But I also hope that, you and I, between us, we can actually explain why that budget needs to go up. Because you take where I'm in Bournemouth, the cost of living is affected here by Ukraine. Because grain can't get out of Odessa, for example, that's actually had an impact on food prices. The oil and gas prices have gone up as well. Yeah. So I always try to take the opportunity to make a direct correlation.
Butt in and so we can jointly meet that challenge of explaining to people who are kind enough to join us and listen to our conversation. I think I told you once before I attended a charity event that was addressed by the Chief of the Defence Staff, and he said this situation in Ukraine is not something that may go on for a few months. It may go on for a decade and more. And we heard James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, on GB News this morning saying our commitment to Ukraine and supporting their borders and their integrity under the UN Charter is absolute and, in effect, open-ended.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important to make the case to the British people, because there will be some that will say, why are we spending money on defence when we've got, quite rightly, we need to invest in our schools, our hospitals, other things as well. I'm just making the point that if you don't look after your security, your prosperity is affected, as it is being affected by Ukraine. But on then your next question, we've done well to support Ukraine, but President Putin is determined to drag this out. He wants a frozen conflict. He's hoping the West will lose the political appetite to stay the course. All the more reason why 2023 will be a critical year. We don't have perhaps the ability to see this drag out for another 10 years. You touched in your introduction about China now looking potentially to support Russia. Can't have its friend lose this battle, therefore now having to weigh in to try and tip the balance. We're going through a very, very dangerous period indeed, and it's all the more important that the West sticks together, helps Ukraine punch through Russian defences. That's why those tanks are critical, to actually regain territory, to show that we've got momentum, push Russia out of Ukraine proper.
Have we been overbold, though, and ended up depleting our own defence resources? God forbid there should be another call, and things like Iraq and Afghanistan are very difficult to predict, but things do crop up, and we may find ourselves without the hardware, the munitions and the rest of it to support, you're a former squadder yourself, to support British fighting men and women if such a dreadful situation were to present itself. And I've also heard a very lucid argument made, and that is Zelensky's request for fighter jets, which the United Kingdom seems more sympathetic towards than the United States of America. Royal Air Force fighting jets are engaged day in, day out, patrolling the security of the airspace over the North Sea against incursions by Russian bombers, Russian reconnaissance aircraft. These aren't guys parked up in hangars just waiting for, oh, chocks away, let's go and have a sortie. They are working 24/7.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to describe a deteriorating security picture. I'm afraid we've had 3 decades of actually being rather complacent since the end of the Cold War. So we've cut back on our Air Force, our Navy capabilities and our Army as well. And now those chickens are coming home to roost. If you don't invest in your armed forces, then I'm afraid your adversaries take advantage of you. And that's what we saw. You know, we gave up in Afghanistan, and Russia took that as an indication of a lack of long-term commitment. I'm sure that encouraged him to then invade Ukraine. If we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, Putin is determined to expand his sphere of influence back into the Warsaw Pact countries. It's so important that we stay there.
That was Zelensky's line that I quoted to 2 of my other guests as well, because I remember discussing it a year ago, where Zelensky said if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will march on Berlin. That may be a little poetic, it may be a little hyperbole, but it's exactly the same point that you've made.
Yes, exactly. Again, testing the will. Moldova would probably be the next place that Russia would then move into. Once you've done Moldova, you're then looking at the Suwalki corridor, this corridor that links that would string off the Baltic nations between Kaliningrad and Belarus. And then, of course, he is starting to spread his influence ever further, backed, I think, more and more so by China. And that sees our world splintering into 2 spheres of influence. You know, we pride ourselves on the fact that we're imposing sanctions, but only 34 nations across the world have actually imposed sanctions. Some big countries are still sitting on the fence. The status quo of our, world order is not working. It's starting to fragment. So we need to lean into this, starting by putting the fire out in Ukraine.
Is it also being redefined in the sense, and I put this to Malcolm Rifkind and Kim Darroch at the beginning of the programme, that it's being redefined by Putin, if he has his way, to a kind of pre-Gorbachev, pre-Perestroika, glasnost, back to the old days of Comic-Con and even the Warsaw Pact?
No, that's exactly it. I think we kid ourselves that somehow Putin is fighting this unpopular war and is about to be ousted. He's as ever popular in Russia because he controls the media. And he also lifted the country out of a very, very poor condition. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia went into huge economic decline. And it was Putin that lifted the country and gave it a sense of purpose and a sense of pride again. So he's able to live off that stock. Most people believe the propaganda, believe this as Western aggression that needs to be stood up to. As long as that exists, we need to recognize this isn't about Ukraine alone. This is about a new appetite of Putin to challenge the West, ever supported by China. And we've been too timid. It's taken us a year to get main battle tanks to Ukraine. And as I stress, Ukraine needs to show it's gaining terrain, punching through Russian defenses. And you can only do that with top cover as well. Hence the call for air superiority, through fast jets.
Tobias, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for breaking into your weekend to do that. And you take care, and I hope you enjoy the rest of it. And thank you very much indeed. Good to talk to you. Tobias Ellwood there, Chair of the Defence Select Committee and Conservative Member of Parliament for Bournemouth East. Now, when the war broke out in Ukraine a year ago, and many of you have been tweeting me and sending emails saying it's not a question of a war breaking out, it's a question of Russia invading a sovereign state that it happens to be called Ukraine, whose borders are supposed to be protected by the United Nations Charter and all of the rest of it. Thousands of people from across Britain opened their homes to refugees that were fleeing that conflict. We've already talked about how many of you went out to Poland and went out to Ukraine to do your bit and help there, either as individuals or with one of the very many charities that you so brilliantly and generously support. But as I say, thousands of people came here fleeing that conflict. while not every sponsorship under the Homes for Ukraine scheme was successful, and certainly it wasn't a great triumph for government communications, that particular policy, but there we are. Many did make it here and were made more than welcome. Britain is now home to around 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, and I think that is something to be very proud of and to celebrate. And I'm delighted to be joined on the programme now by refugee Liana Tatanova and her host, Ravin Nadra Nake. Thank you both very much indeed. Let me start off, if I may, with Liana. Was it anything like you'd imagined it was going to be, or was it totally different?
Hi to everyone. Yes, it was totally different for me. Like new life, new country, new language I should speak. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you hope to be able to get back eventually to Ukraine? Is that the big ambition, or are you so happy here, if it's possible, you'd like to stay?
I have much pain for people in Ukraine and for my country, and I want to come back there as soon as possible. Yes, but I like to live here as well, and I have new people that help each other, support each other, and we can feel as a family here as well.
Well, Liana, you're more than welcome, if I may say so, for as long as is appropriate for you to stay. And what a lovely, lovely family you are blessed with. Ravindra, did it prove to be a lot more complicated than your lovely goodwill and good spirit wanted to make it? Did it just turn out being very difficult?
In the beginning, yeah, it was a bit of challenging, actually, due to the different processes and the Homes for Ukraine scheme. It was very new as well. There were a lot of complications in the beginning, I would say. How do we do this, fill out the applications and all of that? But I think once we passed through that stage, it was okay. We received help from councils and local organizations, groups.
Goodwill often triumphs, and hurrah for that. Ravindra, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. And also, Liana, really lovely to meet you, albeit on television. And you are very welcome. And what a lucky person you are, and your family, with that lovely family that have embraced you. Thank you very much indeed for breaking into your weekend to share those experiences. That, alas, is all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, found it interesting. Great interviews with all of my guests. If you missed any of them, you can catch up on them, and that is by subscribing to our YouTube channel at GBNews on YouTube. And I'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Until then, I hope you enjoy the rest of today and the rest of the weekend. Until then, from all of us on Alastair, Stewart and Friends, a very good afternoon to you. Bye-bye.
Hello, I'm Craig Snow, and here is your latest forecast from the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, it's set to remain largely dry and settled across the country. And that's all courtesy of a huge area of high pressure, which is not going to go very far over the next few days. It does bring in a fairly cool breeze off the North Sea. So if you live along the east coast of England or down across the English Channel, certainly wrap up warmly as we go through the next few days here. For the rest of Saturday, we'll see a lot of the cloud melt away, and that will lead to a cold and frosty night for a lot of the UK. But along the North Sea coast, we will maintain some rather cloudy skies, maybe the odd shower here. So temperatures actually staying above freezing here, but elsewhere could see lows falling down to -4 or -5 in a few spots. So then going into Sunday, very little changes actually. We still maintain rather cloudy skies across northern parts of England, eastern Scotland too. That may well filter its way a little bit further southwards as the day goes on. But elsewhere, plenty of sunshine around after that cold and frosty start, with the afternoon perhaps seeing the best of the sunshine up across western Scotland and maybe down towards Devon and Cornwall. And in that sunshine, temperatures will reach about 8 or 9 degrees, but under the cloud, and also if you're exposed to this fairly brisk wind, it will be feeling a good deal colder than that. Sunday evening then sees a repeat performance, a lot of the cloud melting away once again, leading to a fairly cold and frosty night. But along parts of the North Sea coast, again, the cloud will continue to come in, keeping things above freezing here. So a cold and frosty start to the new working week on Monday morning. Best of the sunshine as we start the day across western Scotland, Northern Ireland, down towards the southwestern parts of the country too. But then as the day goes on, this cloud across more central parts of the country will sink its way a bit further southwards, Largely dry though, but there will still be the odd shower around. And as we go into the middle part of the week, very little changes. Largely dry, often cloudy, but feeling cold in the wind.